So Ezra instituted before Rosh HaShana that one should read the kolos, Parshas Kisavo, as well as Parshas Bechokosai before the new year in order to get rid of the curses and start the year with blessings. And the Gemara says, and Shuas as well is the new year, Peiras Ilan. So Ezra instituted in the Gemara Megillah Lamed Aleph and Beis goes into detail, instituted reading the Tochacha before Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara has so the Mishnah says actually Ein Mafsikin Bekolos. The Mishnah says that one's not permitted to break up the Tochacha. So why not? So the Machokas in the Gemara, why can't we break up the Tochacha? So the first opinion says basically it's inappropriate that God's giving us rebuke. I'm going to put the pause button on and say, well, I'm not in the mood now. Well, he listen to the rest later. If God's telling you something, you listen to it when He wants to tell it to you, not when you want to hear it. And I think that there's a Ma'aser, I think it was the Gerer Rabbi, one of his Chidushei Arim, one of his grandkids were in his yeshiva. I guess one day he didn't see him at Minyan, so he came in and he gave him a whole big mussar shmooze and stuff like that. And then at the end he said, "No, I daven vasikin." So the Rebbe said, "Why didn't you tell me before?" What do you mean? I wanted to hear the mussar shmooze first. But we don't have the choice. When God tells us He's giving us a rebuke, so that's it. So that's the first answer the Gemara gives. Or Reish Lakish writes, "Ein mevarchen ala prunios." You don't make a bracha over prunios, over a davar. If you break up the tochacha, you're going to have to make a new bracha. So we'll see if that's true or not. But if you break up the tocha, you'd have to make a new bracha, and therefore you don't want to be mafsik. In fact, we have a similar yisod in many areas. That's why there's a mitzvah v'hashavas gzela. There's a mitzvah in our Torah to return a stolen object. Alright, so where's the bracha? Why don't we make a bracha? So that's what the Achronim point out. You don't want to make a bracha on something which is associated with a davara. Or, for instance, they explain as well, that's the where they point out by the tochacha, and then so they point out that's why by the mitzvah of tshuva we know there's a machlokas. Actually, it's a whole discussion in Minchas Chinuch. What's clear is the Ramban writes is a mitzvah asim in our Torah of tshuva, and it's a whole discussion in the Rambam in the beginning of Hilchas Tshuva, the Minchas Chinuch, whether kushayasa tshuva. So the Minchas Chinuch wants to say maybe there is no mitzvah chiyuvis of tshuva. The Rav says no, it's impossible to say it in the Rambam. If you look at the Rambam other places, he talks about. So however you want to discuss the Shitas HaRambam, it's clear according to the Ramban there's a mitzvah aseh to do tshuva. So the shaila is where's the bracha? So where's the bracha on the mitzvah of tshuva? So there are many answers given. One is that we don't make a bracha on tshuva because, like we find by other areas, because we know on Erev Pesach we have a mitzvah of bittul chametz and bedikas chametz. So bittul chametz is a mitzvah in our Torah. Bedikas chametz is a derabanan. Yet we make a bracha on the bedika, biur chametz. Why don't we make the bracha on the bittul? So the Gemara says there's bittul b'leiv sagi. So we see when something which is measured in the heart, so Chazal never instituted a bracha. So similarly, they say the same thing by tshuva. In essence, tshuva is a feeling in the heart, is to get closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore Chazal never instituted a bracha on tshuva because it's a mitzvah b'leiv. But others say along these lines, I think the Beis Yitzchak, that no, that why do you do tshuva? Well, it is true we do tshuva mitzvahs, we try to do the mitzvahs better the next time around. But also, it's more so it's associated with Averas. It's a davara, and therefore since tshuva has to do with the davara and Avera, hence Chazal never instituted a bracha. So along those lines, that's what the Reish Lakish says here, that Ein mevarchen ala prunios. There's a kasha, so that's two opinions in the Gemara, why Ein mafsikin b'kolos. There's a interesting kasha the Achronim asked anyway, because if you know, as we spoke about many times before, the issue of Kriyas HaTorah, the original institution was the first person got Kohen.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, I know Shechianu you don't say something that involves something bad, but a regular bracha, I mean, you say Adayin Emes.
Right. No, there is a concept of Kshen Shemavarchen, Kshen Shemavarchen, Arakach Mavarach Alatov. That's the kind of times to use. So it's a Adayin Emes by Avelis. So in other words, what someone in Machalik, but the good kash is that when someone dies, it isn't necessarily a bad. It's not necessarily an objectively like this, like something bad happened to me personally, or it's a loss. But let's say someone's stealing or someone's doing an avera, that that act is objectively. So the Chazal didn't institute a bracha. Death is part of the cycle of life. And that's why even there's discussion about making a shachianu even when a person dies if they leave you a lot of money. Yeah, but they start to right. It has, I think, so the luck they bring down shachianu. So I think Rabbi Yaakov says the meaning is not to, but then so they say so you can make atov a meitiv.
It's not the person who's dying who makes the bracha. It's the person who's alive. Because the reason you're doing it is because supposedly it has a negative effect on you. That is why. Isn't that why you're making the bracha?
Because what? Because we're
going to look at it and say, well, what's God doing?
I think Emes that we believe that he's going to a better place and there's justice, whatever.
Because otherwise, a person would think, why is God taking this person? That's not just. There's certainly a negative aspect to it.
Oh, yeah.
If you're the dead person, you could say maybe you're going way to heaven and it's good. But for the alive person, you can't say that.
Yeah, Tosfos there talks also another about Kadosh Baruch Hu Zeh B'tzar. So when you lose someone, so then he feels the loss also. But let's say on a Dvar Aveira, maybe it's different here.
I thought it was a difference between the tongue of Berachos Mitzvah versus Berachos Vodah. That in Emes is a Berachos Vodah. It's a statement about the facts. But the other situation is a Berachos Mitzvah to say Bracha and a Berachos Mitzvah. That one the thing that was girding the mitzvah was an Aveira. That's the problem.
And he's saying Asher Ketzah Mitzvah B'Tzivano.
And what's girding it is the fact that you did an Aveira, which means you were not following Tzivah Hashem. Okay, so that's a special thing because of this. The dynamics of Berachos Vodah is a totally different thing.
Right. So they point out that the original takana was one person made a bracha. You had the 7 aliyahs, but one person made the bracha at the beginning and at the end. So what is Reish Lakish talking about? Bizman HaMishnah, or even maybe whenever the takana was actually changed. What do you mean? What do you mean we're afraid of making a bracha? What bracha? You could call up 20 aliyahs. You don't make brachas. You just go up. So how does so that's the kasha they ask. So the two schools of thought is, I think it's a Ritva in Megillah that he wants to minimize. It's not such a black and white raw that was always true, that the one person just made a bracha and that was it. Like basically one bracha on the Kriyas Torah. He thought it was more of that basically as long as everyone who got the aliyah was there to hear the bracha and kind of like you machavin and listen to the bracha, so you did make the bracha, but it didn't count. But you made the bracha without saying anything. However, so therefore he said it's not a black and white rule. So if someone, according to the ritual, if you walked in during Shlishi and you were getting Revi, you would have to make a bracha even Mizman HaMishta. That's how some weren't. But let's assume not the way. The Pashtus is that it's one bracha on the Kriyas Torah. So what does it mean Mafsik? And so that's what Achronim point out. That even if that was the case, however, that's what the Gemara is telling us. There wasn't always this year. It always works out the way we have it set up that we read Kisavo next to Rosh HaShana because we finish an annual cycle. But in the 3-year cycle, you didn't do it. So what the Gemara is telling me, Ezra was misakin. You could be in the middle of Mishpatim, wherever you're up to that year, however it went. However you split the 3 parak, however you did the split, but you weren't reading Kisavo before Rosh Hashanah. So whatever parasha you read, and then you had to take out kind of like Parashat Zachar or Parashat Shkolim. You took out another Sefer Torah, and then so that's what the Achron pointed. For a different Machayev, you need to set each Machayev needs its own bracha. So Parashat Shavuot gets one bracha, but if I'm reading Takanas Ezra, so therefore they point out that there was a bracha, but even though the kasha is, but even if you break it up, why would you have to need another bracha anyway?
What was the original time? Like how much time before Rosh Hashanah? I mean, if the way you find it is that Right, but that if you have to read Kitavo on the Shabbos before Rosh HaShana, that's the din of Shabbos before Rosh HaShana. So we don't let.
No, it's not the right. It's the Gemara that says it gives enough time shetichler. Obviously, it's not the week before, but we do it close by because actually it could be, as we'll see. Maybe you have to read Kisava because you want to get Nitzavim in. I'll get to his Zatosis over there. But you might have to get Nitzavim in also before Rosh Hashanah. But right, he doesn't say it's not the din of the Shabbos before Purim. It's he doesn't give a set time. I guess within 30 days. I guess we don't. What's considered enough time? I guess. And the question is, why didn't he just do it Shabbos before? I mean, but in that period of time, he said that you have to read it. So they point out that in fact that's on this line. I might as well tell you the pshat now because so the Gemara gives differences between the Tocha in Torah Kohanim and the Tocha in Mishnah Torah. So the Gemara gets into Lashon Rab and Lashon Yachid. But besides that, Mefarshim point out there's other differences. Parshas Bechukosai ends with a Nechama. The Eskor, Bris Avos, Abram, Yitzchak, etc. It ends with some hope. But Kisavo, it ends pretty abruptly. You're going to go down to Egypt. You're going to be sold as slave, and no one's going to want you. No buyers. Okay, end very abruptly. No hope. So what's the distinction? Why is it the Parshas Bechukosai ends with hope, but Parshas Kisava doesn't? So some of the Mefarshim Al-Chumash write that by Bechukosai it's imibikeri, that you don't read everything's circumstances, coincidence. So therefore, that's the worst thing when you think punishment. The whole world runs by itself. You don't see God at all. Like for instance, let's say someone's riding down the street and some kid jumps in front of the car. So okay, you scream at him, "What are you doing?" Okay, then you go on. One guy, he jumps, the same kid runs into another car, the guy is a little more forceful. The third time it happens, this guy gets out of the car, chases him 3 blocks, and gives him a good old-fashioned whooping. Who is that third guy? It's his father. The guy who cares about himself, so to speak. In Kisavo, the punishment's from God, so that itself is a ksas nechama. When it's coming, you may be carried, then that's really out of it, therefore you need some nechama. That's somewhere. But the Rav had a different shot. The Rav explained that he says there is a nechama after Parshas Kisavo. We read it in the week right after. In about 50 psukim later, V'shavta Shem Elokecha, if you read on, about 40, 50 psukim later, we have the nechama. So the Kashi then the Rav says, okay, you have to ask Hami then, so why B'chukosai the nechama comes right away? But by Kisavo, we have a break. So he says, based on the Ramban, that Parashas Bechukosai, the Tochacha is alluding to Churban Bayis Rishon. And Parashas Kisavo, that's an allusion to Churban Bayis Sheni. Yes, so how does that help us? Because Churban Bayis Rishon, so even after the destruction, so it was said, we knew right away, 7 years after, we're going to start rebuilding. Of course, there was a major discussion when the 70 years began and end, and a lot of people died because they got it wrong. But whenever the 7 years, there was a finite time. So to here, so right afterwards, okay, you're terrible, okay, don't worry. Nachama v'eskar brisi will give you a finite thing. But by Kisavo, Churban Bayisheni, there is no time. In fact, we're still waiting. So to speak, the Rav says we're in this time period now, in between Parashas Kisavo and Nitzavim, where you have the time period before where the Rambam writes, we have a guarantee because when the Jewish people do tshuva, miyad nigolim. So we're in that time period where it's all the balls in our court, so to speak. If we do tshuva, so then we'll bring it. So that's what the Rav said based on the Ramban. That's why he says Parshas Sabo does end with the Nechama, but this comes later on. So the question is, Tosas asks over there in Megillah, Laman Aleph Amud Beis. Tosas asks, I don't get it. I think it says about reading Nitzavim Vayelach together. Like it's discussion about reading Matos and Masei. But the question is that we read 2 big parashas together, and it falls out that year. So it comes out that we double up, let's say a Matos Masei, but we read that we read Nitzavim. So why not mix? Why not do Nitzavim Vayelach together? As I know, because from my prior life, when I used to be a Baal Koreh, when I used to get $30 a shot, which is, I guess, a lot of money back in the day. And I always remember Vayelach because I was very happy. I got $1 a pasuk. So I always remember 30. I think in Selevan was pretty good also, 40. But I used to have my brother do the Bereshis and the big ones. But either way, so the question was, so why not mix up the big parshas, keep them separate? So Toz over there says no, because we want to make sure, because else you end up reading Nitzavim Vayelach after Rosh HaShana. You want to get Nitzavim in, because that's also part of the Tocha. So the Rav's thing is based really on the Tosas and Megillah already alludes to the fact that Nitzavim has something to do, with the Tochacha. That's what they point out. Why one ends with the Chama, or one possibly doesn't end with the Chama, or it does end, but you have to find it next week. So either way, that's the two opinions of the Gemara. Why Emav Sika Makolas? Either because it's inappropriate, or because Emav Varchan Al Prunias. We don't want to do, Birkas HaMitzvah, on a Aveira, on a Davara. So then the Gemara goes on and says that, and comes along Abaye and qualifies it. He says, when do we say Emav Sika Makolas? When can you break up the Tochacha? That's only when you're reading from Torah's Kohanim, from Vayikra, B'Chukosai. But when you're reading from Mishnah Torah, then it's okay. So the Gemara says, my time, why we're discriminating against Mishnah Torah as contrast to Torah's Kohanim? So that's where actually the famous discussion, they say the Dubdo Magid went to the Vilna Gaon and asked them, is there a difference between Sefer Devarim and the first 4 books? So you speak to the biblical critics, they'll tell you a lot of things, how Devarim might be different. But the Dubno Magid asked the Vilna Gaon, and they said, so he said basically, he's probably paraphrasing this Gemara in Megillah, but he basically said is that the Sefer Devarim was given on a lower level of Nevuah than the first 4 books of Moses. It's because the Lashon HaGemara is that the first Parshas B'Chukosai, that was given directly from God, and I'll borrow the phrase Shina Shchina Midaberach B'Tov Grono Shel Moshe. Basically, Moshe opened his mouth, the words came out. So it's all one. But in Devarim, it says Moshe and Pi Atzma. Of course, Tosafos immediately writes Baruch HaKodesh, but not to be taken literally that Moshe didn't write Sefer Devarim by himself. So we see from that Gemara, whatever the Gemara means, but we see a distinction in Nevuah between the book of Midbar, the first 4 books, and Devarim. In fact, it's interesting, Rav Chaim Volozhin, who is known as the Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, again, as I always say, Talmidim are like we are today in many ways, but they're not in the sense that, in this sense, the Talmud usually is sitting in the person's shir, you go, and etc., but during those days there was no shir. The Rav Chaim Volozhin, whether it was 3 or 4 times a year, he used to come for a day or 2 and to speak and learning all day, and he used to go back. So he was known as the Talmud of the Vilna Gaon. He actually disagreed. I think it's in the Nefesh HaChaim. He writes the opposite, and the Rav has this also, that Sefer Devarim is on the highest level of Nevuah. In fact, it's kind of like, I think the Rav put it, it's a Torah Shabbat Peh, the Torah Shabbat. Yet Moshe Rabbeinu was in the zenith. I think Rav Chaim quotes a Ramban also in Devarim saying also similar, that Sefer, how do they do with the Gemara? They might think they say it's a different Gersa in it, but that seems to be the tension between the Vilna Gaon and Rav Chaim Volozhin and others. But that's what they asked the Dubno. He asked the Dubno Magid. That's famous. Everyone quotes it in a different sperm. So it's based on this Gemara that Moshe is talking directly, but by Mishnah Torah he's talking not as whatever that means exactly, not as directly as the first 4 books. So therefore, in B'Chukosai, that's considered a much bigger insult. But when it's only Moshe, whatever that means, if it's only Moshe, it's okay. You can be mafsik in the kolos. But either way, that's the distinction Abaye makes. But Lamaisa anyway, we don't mafsik either in Parashas Kisavo as well in the Tochacha there. In fact, as the Gemara says, what we do, our minhag is we give the Baal Koreh usually, and that's and some have some minhagim to read it very quickly and softly, as of course the Chafetz Chaim screamed against that minhag. He said that's the thing, you should be screaming and reading nice and slow. But not that those people would be listening anyway. But he says, and therefore you give it to the Gavak, you don't want to look like you hate the guy and you're giving him the portion of the Tochacha, so therefore you start before and you end afterwards. But that's the whole discussion over there in terms of what the level of Nevuah in Sefer Devarim, in terms of in terms of the Mishnah Torah, Moshe, because that's the Ramban in the Akdamat to Sefer Devarim, who asked the obvious question, Mishnah Torah, what do you mean Mishnah Torah? Some rerun, usually when a rerun looks the same way, you watch, whatever you watch, Seinfeld or whatever it is, and you watch it the second time, whether it's more funny or less funny, it's a separate discussion, but it's the same show. What kind of rerun is Mishnah Torah? So you have so many. In fact, he has the most mitzvahs in the whole 70 in its own right. Whether a couple of hundred, whatever the number is in Dvarim. So the Ramban has this whole yisod about that Sefer Dvarim is for the Dor HaNichnas LeEretz Yisrael, or I should say, to exclude the Dor HaMidbar, but it applies to us also, and everyone who came after the Dor, and he goes into explaining how many of the mitzvahs were given for Birkas HaMazon, we discussed Birkas HaTorah, etc. But that's what the Gemara says over there. They make a distinction between Parashas Kisavo and Parashas Bechukosai, and then they get into the distinction of Lashon Rabim and Lashon Yachid, because as the Gemara says in many other places, maybe it's counterintuitive or not, the Lakachtem Lachem, when it's Lashon Rabim, it's a Chol Echad V'Echad, and when it's Lashon Yachid, so then it's talking to kind of like the Beis Hagadol as a Jewish people, as a communal, like someone explained, like that's why we have like Baal Tosef. Baal Tosef is mentioned twice, once in Lashon Yachid and once in Lashon Rabim. So the different answers why the difference Lashon Rabim and Lashon Yachid. So some want to say, try to answer of a Rambam, because we all know Baal Tosef is you put on 5 species on the lulav, on the dalaminim, you add an extra parasha to the tefillin. But the Rambam seems to say a chiddush that if you say, that chicken and milk is a biblical prohibition, that's also about Tosef. Where did he get that from? Where do we say so? So I want to say from one is the Lashon Rabim Chol Echad V'Echad on the Chefsa, one's on the Gavra. They're going to give different answers. Lashon Rabim, Lashon Yachid. The Orach Chaim has a totally different answer. The Orach Chaim HaKadosh writes on Lashon Rabim, he wants to say that even though he wants to say that Lashon Rabim is something the opposite, that we want to be part of the Rabim, that before Rosh HaShana, as Rabbi Salanto, you don't want to be a Yachid Shaharabim, you want to be a Yachid Shaharabim Tolibo, because who could stand on their own schusim? So therefore, if you work for the community, you do in that merit, and that's what he wants to explain. That's why there's no. I guess he's claiming that Kisavos to Lashon Rabim. That's why he's saying there's no, or he's explaining why Mechosai Teleko has a Nachama. But I think he was talking in the context of if it's Lashon Rabim, so you don't need a Nachama, or in terms of how he ties it into the Tochacha, that's a discussion. But his yisod is that if you're part of the Rabbim, so therefore that's the goal, and that's how they explain that's how they explain the story with Elisha when he was staying when he was out in Almana. So right, so they said, so he was doing the widow was doing all these favors. He said, what could I do? So what can I do for you? If you have any parking tickets, what do you want me to do for you? And so they point out, he hayom, which some also point out, hayom, they say hayom is referring to Rosh HaShana, the Midrash, but the pasuk here, in Navi says they're referring to, she wasn't just asking going to a melech plus of Adam, She was, at least she was telling, I'll go have a connections to God. Tell me what you need, what you want. And she said, "This v'sochami anochi yoshavas." She says, "No, I don't want anything. I just want to be judged among the people. I don't want to be judged as a yachid. I want to be judged as an individual, as part of the Rabbi." And that's how the whole Maharal talks about with the connection with Ribbis at Eretz Yisrael, the juxtaposition the pasuk has about not taking Ribbis. So I forgot the exact lashon, something about with the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael. So what's the connection? So in the Avnei Nezer has this Yisod also, where he talks about how, and that's the Gemara about the Nekudos, that even though we had personal achrayas at Har Sinai, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, I think it's Nigmar Hardin discusses it, but that even though we had personal achrayas at Har Sinai, but the communal responsibility didn't begin until we went into Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael, Kol Yisrael Reivim Zelazeh, Harevo, that's the whole Avnei Nezer, and others discuss, and Eretz Yisrael represents our Achta. So what is taking ribbis? Taking ribbis is someone's vulnerable, you're taking advantage of them. In that sense, Eretz Yisrael is the opposite, is a term of you treat everyone, with the brotherly love, so to speak. So that's what they say about the shofar, the whole essence of the shofar, that when we hear the shofar on Rosh HaShana, that we should be thinking v'sochami anochi yoshavas, that's why in fact there's a whole discussion, a whole shir on it, about whether the mitzvah of shofar is the shmiya, the tekiah, but the Rambam, the way we assume, at least since we make the bracha l'shmoa kol shofar, and that's the Rambam. At least the mitzvah, Rambam makes a distinction between the mitzvah shofar on Yovel and the mitzvah shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but the Rambam writes about the mitzvah shmiya, etc. So there's a whole discussion about machlokas or Otam Rambam and many nafkaminas in terms of what the mitzvah is. So there's discussion. What about saying Shomea Ka'ona? In other words, do we say Shomea Ka'ona by shofar? So some want to say there's no Shomea Ka'ona there's no Shomea Ka'ona by the shofar. So when the Avnei Nezer has a discussion, but the point, the nekuda they're making is that because the Ramosha has a tshuva on it, where
referring to the bracha or to the kol shofar?
No, the shofar, the bracha. Yeah, bracha is, everyone says you have it on the bracha, and the actual kol shofar. So that's what they point out. That Ramosha has a tshuva where, let's say someone goes to the bathroom or something in the middle of Musaf, about could you make he gets into hafsakas, or let's say actually he talks about if you're in the middle of, he's doing more for Svardim, but it can happen anyway, it depends how long each one Esrei is. If you, especially the Nusach Svar would say do the tekios and decide which one Esrei, you have to be in the spot where you have to be. So it's a whole sugya in brachas and sukkah, Shomea Ka'ona, and the Machlokas, Rashi and Tosas, what do you do by Kedusha? Do I listen to, get the whole sugya there? So Rav Moshe writes over here, it's not an issue. There is no Shomea Ka'ona here, because the mitzvah is the shmiya. The nakuda of the shmiya is when the shmiya everyone's doing it, because you want everyone dafka by shofar, and that's why that's why the nafkamid in the nusach habracha in terms of if the mitzvah is blowing or hearing, but that's what they point out, that the mitzvah shmiya dafka, everyone want everyone to hear it, everyone to be equal. It's not that even the Rambam the person incidentally blows the shofar, but the issue is that everyone's hearing the shofar. And it's all about that yisod of v'sochami anochi yoshavas, that we have to be part of the Rabbah. And that's why some point out, even though Ezra didn't always have it, but now we also read in the beginning of Kisava, not just the Tochacha, but we also read the Parasha of Bikurim, and they also point out the Mefarshim, that's not coincidental either, that the Parashas Bikurim, as we know, B'Shir Reishis Nivra Olam, that the world was created because of Bikurim. That Bikurim represents Hakaras HaTov, and in fact, there's a Medrash Tanchuma which writes that someone who doesn't have Hakaras HaTov he's a Kafi Tova, and he's a Kedino Ka'api Kores. Someone who doesn't have Hakaras HaTov, that you treat him like an Api Kores. And in fact, that's what they point out, the whole essence, Yehudi. What is the essence of a Jew? That's what it means. So the admission, admitting, and that's what they point out. Interesting. I think the Avidrama, some point out that we know we have a concept of Chazaras Hashat. So we go ahead and we repeat the Shemot Esrei, and the Chazan repeats for everyone. There's one part of Chazaras Hashat that we don't rely on a shliach. Ein shlichus. We do it ourselves. Modim anachnuach. When it comes to Hakaras Hatov, you can't send someone else to, again, that gets in, unless in that case, that's the whole discussion by Shalach Maz, unless it's better to do it to a third party. By Pashas, Modim anachnuach, you have to do it yourself. And that's the yisod they say by Yosef, by Ashes Potiphar, that when she tried to seduce him, so the pasuk said, well, how could I do it? Your husband did so much for me. That's the psuka. And there's interesting medrash we're all familiar with. It says, when Yosef was contemplating, so the mus yukno shalaviv is the image of Yaakov came down, and then he stopped. So which one was it? The mus yukno shel Yaakov, or because the pasuk says? So the Mefarshim say Hainu Hach, because who was the first one? Well, one of the first to invent Hakaras Hatov. That's Yaakov Avinu. The Mefarshim write when he made Sukkot. Sukkot is coming up, but Yaakov, who got all his Tanah, his livelihood from the animals, up until now you had the okay corral, you left them outside in the snow, rain, weather. But Yaakov said, what these animals are making a living off, let me build huts and sukkahs around them. So they say Yaakov that's one of his midas of Torah, Hakaras Hatov. He was one of the first ones to introduce this concept of Hakaras Hatov, and that's the pshat. The mus yokna shalaviv, Hakaras Hatov, it's not a kasha, it complements the pasuk. And just to conclude, it's a famous Maisa, I think it's a Rav Henkin, it's one of the Gedolim from Europe, back in the day when they used to have telegraphs, where you had to pay for word. You had 25 words, 50, whatever it was, and you couldn't go over. So someone went to Rav Henkin, and they said, I have an extra word, I got to know which one to choose. Should I leave out please, or should I leave out thank you? Of course you're thinking thank you is 2 words, but of course in Yiddish thank you is only 1 word. So the question is, which one should I leave out, please or thank you? And he says, please, it's nice to speak in a nice way, but thank you, that's a chiyuv of the right, that's Hakaras Hatov, you have to say thank you, and he left in that. So that's what also the Mefarshim point out, that even though maybe it wasn't always that way, because what Ezra is, I don't know if he instituted to read the whole Parashat Kisov, maybe just the Tochacha, but today we have it anyway. So one of the reasons we have Bikurim right before Rosh HaShana as well is the aspect of Hakaras Hatov, and that's why we all know that that's the famous medrash with Moshe Rabbeinu. He didn't want to turn the Nile River into blood, because, which we see another yisod they point out in Hakaras Hatov, is that even if the person didn't even do that, he was just doing what he's supposed to do. The Nile River was flowing, not special for Moshe, it was doing what he had to. Nevertheless, Moshe still had the Hakaras Hatov. And they say, Afilu b'shogeg, even if you had no intention to help the person. And they say there's no statute of limitations. If someone did a tova for you 20 years ago, it's not that it's over with. There's always an Indian of Hakaras Hatov. So that's what Ezra instituted, and not only the Parsha of Tochacha, Parshas Bikurim as well, that one should take all these, we should all take these things in mind, being part of the Rabbim before Rosh HaShana, or all year round, especially to be a Yochid Sharabim Talibo, and also, to have a not to be a Kafi Tov, and to have a Karas Hatov, for all the people, and also, HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well. Have a Ksima ve-chatima tova.